Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. In the small town of Silver Creek, where the houses were painted in pastel colors and the streets seemed frozen in time, Jamal Williams lived. His apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building that overlooked a busy street. There, among the paints, brushes, and canvases, Jamal created his own world, a world that was brighter and fairer than the real one. Jamal was known in his neighborhood as a kind and talented man. His works often adorned the windows of small stores or cafes. Despite this, his life was not easy. Born into a family of a laborer and a nurse, he knew from childhood that black people in this city had to fight for a place in the sun. His dream of opening his own art gallery seemed almost unattainable. In a city where prejudice and racism were as old as the sidewalks, most people looked at Jamal as just another guy off the street. "Why would you do that?" his friend and neighbor Marcus once asked him. "Nobody in this town will support you. Do you see the way they look at us?" "That's why I have to do this," Jamal replied calmly. Leaning over the canvas, his brush glided across the surface, creating an image of a man with his head up, standing against the burning crowd. "Art should speak for us. It should change their hearts." Jamal started each morning with a walk around the neighborhood. He found inspiration in everyday life, in the laughter of children, in the smile of the old woman selling newspapers on the corner, even in the cracks in the asphalt, which he said resembled the broken soul of the city. But behind all this beauty lurked a tension. Silver Creek has been the scene of protests many times. A few years ago, a police officer shot and killed an unarmed black teenager in the same town, sparking a wave of anger. People took to the streets with placards shouting, "Justice for all." But as time went on, the situation changed little. Jamal tried to avoid talking about politics. He believed his art could be a powerful weapon. But sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he felt the heaviness of his skin color. It wasn't just a feature. It was a symbol that could become a cause for hatred. "You're too naive," his mother once told him. "You can't change this world with pictures. They won't even look at you unless you're a victim." These words echoed in Jamal's mind whenever he saw a police car drive by. He knew that his dream required not only talent but also great courage. And that evening, when he, tired, decided to go to the store for groceries, Jamal could not have imagined that he would become the hero of a story that would change his life forever. It had been a long day. Jamal had spent most of the evening working on a new project in which he wanted to show the struggle for equality. His hands smelled of acrylics, and his eyes were slightly watery from the long hours of exertion. Deciding to take a break, he went to the nearest store to get some groceries. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. The streets were beginning to empty, and the air was cool. Jamal pulled up the hood of his dark jacket to protect himself from the wind and walked toward the store. There was no sign of trouble. At the same time, just a few blocks away, a local jewelry store was robbed. The assailant was armed, but fortunately no one was injured. Eyewitnesses described the perpetrator as a tall man in dark clothing. That was enough to call the police. Jamal wasn't aware of what had happened when he entered the small store on the corner of the street. He leisurely picked out bread and juice, occasionally smiling at the cashier, a young girl named Linda who was always friendly to him. "Out late today, Jamal?" she asked, rifling through his purchases. "Work doesn't wait," he replied with a smile. After paying, he took the bag and headed for the exit. On the street, he noticed glimpses of blue and red lights of police cars flashing in the distance. Jamal paid no attention to it and continued on his way home. A few minutes later, however, a loud voice sounded behind him. "Hey, stop, hands up." Jamal stopped, turned around slowly, and saw a policeman approaching him quickly. It was Officer Tom Harper, a man in his 40s, known for his tough temper. "What's going on?" Jamal asked calmly, raising his hands. "You fit the description," Harper replied sharply. "Tall, dark jacket. Answer the questions or you'll be sorry." "Under the description of what?" Jamal wondered. "I was just walking home with groceries." But Harper wasn't listening. He stepped closer, snatched the bag from Jamal, and began to search it. A sketchbook fell out of the bag, and Harper picked it up with a sneer. "What do we have here? A robbery plan." His tone was drenched in sarcasm. "They're my drawings," Jamal replied calmly, though he was seething inside. "You can check the store's cameras. I didn't do anything." "You'll do anything when I tell you to," Harper growled, turning Jamal sharply to face the nearest lamppost and handcuffing him. "This is a mistake," Jamal said loudly, trying to keep his composure. "You haven't even checked my alibi." By this point, people were starting to gather around. Passers-by stopped to see what was happening. Someone took out his phone to take pictures of what was happening. "What are you doing?" Harper shouted an elderly woman from the crowd. "It's just a guy from our neighborhood. He didn't do anything." "Don't interface," Harper said without turning around. Jamal felt the tension building around him. A mixture of rage and fear boiled up inside him. He knew that in situations like this, any wrong move could end in tragedy. Suddenly, another officer emerged from the police car, younger and seemingly less severe. He was Eric Sanders, new to the department. He quickly assessed the situation and approached Harper. "Harper, what's going on here?" he asked, looking at the crowd, which was beginning to get noisy. "This guy fits the description of the suspect," Harper said confidently. "So," Sanders continued, "did you check his alibi? The cameras?" "I don't need it," Harper cut him off. "It's necessary if we're going to do our job right," Sanders said coldly and looked at Jamal. "Where have you been, boy?" "At the store. The cashier will confirm it," Jamal replied, barely keeping his voice steady. Sanders nodded, headed toward the store, and soon returned. He was holding a surveillance printout that clearly showed Jamal in the store at the time of the robbery. "He couldn't have been at the scene," Sanders said, showing the evidence. The crowd murmured, expressing relief and indignation at the same time. Harper reluctantly removed the handcuffs, his face flaming with anger. "You're just lucky," he hissed, glaring at Jamal. Jamal, finally freeing himself, adjusted his jacket and looked into Harper's eyes. "It's not luck, it's the truth, and the truth is stronger than your hatred," he said quietly but firmly. With these words he walked away, leaving the turmoil behind him. There was only one question in his mind: how many more people were suffering from the same unfair accusations? Tom Harper returned to his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. He was angry not at himself, of course, but at the system, at his colleague Eric Sanders, who had dared to refute him, and at Jamal, whose calm confidence irritated him to the core. This was not the first such incident for Harper. He had faced accusations of bias many times in his 20-year career, but had always gotten away with it. His superiors turned a blind eye to the complaints and his colleagues were reluctant to get involved. He considered himself a professional and truly believed that he knew criminals at a glance. Jamal's words, "The truth is stronger than your hatred," rattled around in Harper's head. It was like they were cutting him from the inside out. "What does he know?" Harper muttered under his breath. "The whole neighborhood knows they're all just looking for a riot." He recalled the events of a few years ago, when protests broke out in Silver Creek over police brutality. For Harper, it had been a personal affront. He saw the protests as a threat to his order, to his authority. In the backseat of his car was a walkie-talkie, which at that moment came to life. We got a signal on East Street. Could be the same suspect. Your area, Officer Harper. Tom grasped at it as if it were salvation. Copy that, he replied, turning on the siren. When he arrived on the scene, Eric Sanders was already there, talking to a group of people who had seen someone suspicious running across the yards. Harper got out of the car, slamming the door defiantly. What have we got? He asked sharply, walking over to Sanders. Eyewitnesses say they saw someone who could be our suspect. Looks like the robbery was not without an accomplice, Sanders explained, holding up a notebook. Well, if that's the case, Harper looked around at the passersby. We can't waste any time. He noticed again several black teenagers standing at the nearest corner, chatting amongst themselves. What are these guys doing here? Harper hissed, nodding in their direction. They're just locals, Sanders replied, noticing where his colleague was looking. Local? In a place like this? Harper snorted. I'll talk to them. Upon approaching the teens, he immediately became aggressive. Hey, what are you guys doing here? The boys looked at each other, not understanding what was wrong. Just standing there. Sure, one of them answered cautiously. Just standing there. That's a good place for just standing. Harper frowned. Maybe you're covering for someone. We're not doing anything wrong, the other teen said, trying to remain calm. Really? Harper leaned closer. Why do you have such expensive sneakers? Where'd you get the money for those? Sanders, who was watching from a distance, felt anger boiling up inside him. He stepped closer. Harper, enough. This has nothing to do with them. What are you, the protector now? Harper turned to his colleague. Listen, new guy, you don't understand how this city works yet. I understand one thing, you're out of line, Sanders replied stiffly. The crowd of passers-by began to gather again, some filming on their phones. One of the teenagers said quietly, "It's really not our fault. Why do you hate us so much?" The words hurt Harper, but not as much as he would have liked. He saw them as a challenge. Because you're always looking for trouble, he threw, not thinking of the consequences. Sanders reacted instantly. Are you serious right now? Can you hear yourself? Harper, ignoring him, walked back to the car. Do what you want, Eric, but don't be surprised when they set you up. It tossed over his shoulder. This night was just beginning, but one thing was already clear. Harper wouldn't stop until he found someone to pin the blame on. Jamal walked through the streets of his neighborhood, trying not to think about the humiliation he had just endured. His hands were still shaking, and the grocery bag seemed heavier. Harper's words echoed in his head, "You're just lucky." He knew it wasn't luck. It was stupidity, hate, and if it hadn't been for Sanders' intervention, it could have ended much worse. Luck, Jamal muttered under his breath, shaking his head. That's all they see in us. He turned onto his street when he heard the sound of sirens. A police car stopped in front of a neighboring house, and Jamal frowned. Two officers got out of it. One of them was Harper. You again? Jamal felt his insides grow cold. Harper noticed him almost immediately. His eyes squinted, like a predator stalking prey. Are you still hanging around? He threw, coming closer. I'm going home, Jamal replied calmly. Oh, yeah, maybe you're just checking for a place to hide? At my house, Jamal replied sharply, unable to contain his irritation. Is this too complicated for you, officer? The crowd began to gather again. People were watching from the window and from the street, trying to figure out what the policeman had done this time. Harper stepped closer and jabbed a finger at Jamal's chest. Look, kid, your insolence is gonna cost you. Jamal took a step back, trying to keep his composure. Is that what you call insolence? You attacked me for no reason, and now you're trying to humiliate me again. I'm doing my job, Harper snarled. Your job? Jamal could barely contain his anger. Your job is to protect people, not to hunt the innocent. Those words seemed to enrage Harper. He pulled out the handcuffs, stepped forward, and grabbed Jamal's arm sharply. You're under arrest for disobeying an officer, he shouted. This is overkill, shouted someone from the crowd. Harper, that's enough. Sanders' voice came from the side of the car. He ran out and literally stepped between Harper and Jamal. What are you doing? Sanders hissed, turning to his partner. He's provoking me. Harper tried to sound confident, but his voice shook with anger. Provoking? He was just trying to get home, Sanders shouted, addressing everyone around him. Jamal was finally able to free his hand from Harper's iron grip. I'm not going anywhere until you admit it's illegal, he said, looking straight into the officer's eyes. Harper fell silent. The crowd began to shout and murmur, shouting words of encouragement to Jamal. Sanders looked at the crowd, then at Jamal. You can go home now. We'll take care of it, he said. But Jamal didn't budge. Can you figure it out? No, this has to change. People like him shouldn't wear uniforms. Sanders realized the situation was getting out of hand. He turned to Harper. You crossed the line, and you know it. Harper, silently, turned and walked away to his car, slamming the door angrily. Jamal felt the weight fall from his shoulders, but he also realized that this battle was far from over. Jamal woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling. Sleep didn't bring relief. The memories of last night's confrontation with Harper continued to weigh on him, but he decided that he would not remain silent any longer. He realized it was time to act. Taking his backpack, Jamal went to a local cafe where activists and residents who were not afraid to discuss the city's problems often gathered. This place, called Voice of the Streets, was a kind of community center where everyone could express their thoughts. As soon as he walked in, several people who had seen yesterday's scene immediately approached him. Jamal, you okay? We saw everything yesterday. This Harper guy is totally freaking out, said Karen, one of the activists. I'm fine, he replied, trying to look confident, but we need to do something about it. What do you suggest? Marcus asked, sitting at one of the tables with a cup of coffee. First of all, I want as many people as possible to know about this. We have recordings. We need to gather everyone who is ready to support and demand an explanation from the police, Jamal said. The discussion went on for about an hour. People agreed with Jamal, but many were afraid to speak openly. They might come after us, Karen said. Harper always takes revenge on those who go against him. That's what he's counting on, Jamal replied. But if we keep quiet, he'll continue to do the same. After collecting signatures and arranging a meeting with local journalists, Jamal felt he had taken the first step, but the day was just beginning, and he did not yet know how hard it would be. That night Jamal decided to have dinner at a small restaurant in the center of town. It was a quiet place where families or students usually gathered. He took a table by the window and flipped through sketches in his notebook while he waited for his order. But his calm was interrupted by a noise. The restaurant door opened with a loud bang, and Harper appeared on the doorstep. Another officer followed him, but luckily it wasn't Sanders. Harper was clearly looking for someone, his eyes fixed on Jamal. Jamal felt the blood run cold in his veins. Harper approached his table with a smug grin. And you, I see, are relaxing, he said loudly, attracting the attention of the visitors. Jamal looked up, trying not to show fear. I'm just having dinner. Is that forbidden? Not now, Harper said, sitting down across from him uninvited. You think you can hunt me down, you and your friends from the Street Voice? Jamal was silent, but his heart was beating faster and faster. Listen here, boy. Harper leaned closer. You think justice is on your side. You think I'm gonna be scared of a bunch of activists. I think justice is what you fear the most, Jamal replied calmly. That answer pissed Harper off. He slapped his hand on the table, making the plates clank. You're going to regret getting involved, he hissed, rising. The whole restaurant frowned. People were watching this scene. Some of them had already started filming on their phones. I guess this time, everyone will see how you use power to threaten people, Jamal said loudly, looking directly into the camera of the nearest phone. Harper realized he'd gone too far. His partner came over and tugged at his sleeve. It's time to go, Harper, he said quietly. Harper threw Jamal one last baleful glance and walked out of the restaurant. Jamal breathed a sigh of relief, but knew it was private now. Eric Sanders couldn't sleep for a long time that night. After the scene with Harper last night, his mind was spinning with thoughts of injustice and what he could have done differently. He was new to the department, but he had already realized that there were those among his colleagues who abused their power. This was especially true of Harper, whose reputation as a rude and biased officer was well known. Eric wasn't sure he had the strength for support to challenge the system, but his sense of justice kept him on his toes. He remembered Jamal's words about truth being stronger than hate. Maybe he's right, Eric said quietly to himself as he sat in his small apartment with a cup of coffee. The next day, after getting a new shift, Eric decided to spring into action. He knew that Harper would likely continue to look for ways to hurt Jamal, and if he wanted to stop it, he needed to gather evidence. The first thing Eric did was contact Linda, the cashier at the store where Jamal had been the night of the robbery. Hey, Linda, this is Officer Sanders. I'd like to talk to you about the events of that night, he began. Of course, she replied. I already told the police that I saw Jamal. He was just buying groceries. Can you give me access to the security footage? Eric asked. Of course I'll keep them for you, Linda confirmed. Eric arrived at the store and took the flash drive with the recordings. They clearly showed that Jamal was in the store at the time of the jewelry store robbery. Great, Eric thought. That's the first link. But he knew it wasn't enough to stop Harper. It had to be shown that his bias wouldn't be in single cases. Eric decided to talk to a few locals who could talk about their encounters with Harper. He met with Marcus and Karen from Street Voices. We've been suspicious of Harper for a long time, Marcus said. He always finds something to pick on, especially when it comes to black people or people he just doesn't like. Do you have any proof? Eric asked. We have some cell phone footage. People here often film his actions, Karen replied. Eric looked at the tapes. One of them showed Harper detaining a teenager for no apparent reason, demanding to see the contents of his backpack. In another, he threatened a woman with a fine for disorderly conduct, even though she simply demanded an explanation. This footage was shocking. Eric realized that Harper posed a real threat to the community he was supposed to protect. At the end of his shift, Eric walked into the station, where he found Harper sitting at his desk. He grinned when he saw his young colleague. What's up, new guy? Still trying to be a hero? Eric didn't answer. He sat down at his desk and began writing a report, in which he outlined all his observations of Harper's behavior. Do you think you can go against me? Harper asked sarcastically, noticing that Sanders was writing something. I think my job is to protect people, not humiliate them, Eric replied calmly. Harper stood up, his face tense. You're gonna regret getting in my way, kid. If anyone should be sorry, it's you, Eric replied, not lifting his eyes from the paper. Eric knew that his actions could make him a target not only for Harper, but also for others who prefer to turn a blind eye to problems. But he decided to go all the way, because truth really should be stronger than hate. Eric Sanders sat in the station's small room, where the only old computer with database access and video review tools stood. He inserted the thumb drive he'd received from Linda into the USB port and began reviewing the surveillance footage from the grocery store. The videotape clearly showed Jamal entering the store at about 9:45 p.m. The time on the cash register receipt also matched. In the video, Jamal slowly walked between the shelves, selecting products, then walked to the cash register, paid and left the store. Eric stopped the video and leaned back in his chair. He couldn't have been involved, he muttered. It was 9:52 p.m. when Jamal left the store, and the signal about the attack on the jewelry salon came to the console at 9:50. The salon was several blocks away from the store. It was physically impossible. Sanders decided to check another part of the tape, the moments when Jamal was at the register. Linda was standing behind the counter, smiling, having a small conversation with him. Eric amplified the sound to catch what they were talking about. "What's up, Jamal? Everything okay?" Linda asked. "Yeah, just a long day," he replied. "I'm tired, but I want to get home as soon as possible." Eric stopped the video again, capturing the moment when Linda handed him the check. He took a screenshot of the screen to save that moment for his report. However, one recording was not enough. Eric decided to match it with another camera installed on the street near the store. Connecting to the city's camera database, he found the right stretch of road and entered the time period from 9:40 to 10. The recording confirmed that at 9:53 a.m., Jamal was leaving the store heading toward his home. But then Eric noticed something strange. The camera captured the figure of another man running towards the jewelry salon. It was a man of medium height, wearing a hood, whose face was hidden. He was holding a backpack with something sticking out of it. Eric slowed down the recording and took a still picture. The man looked around quickly, clearly afraid of being seen. "There's the suspect," Eric said aloud. Now Eric had solid evidence that could completely exonerate Jamal. He returned to his desk to compile a detailed report. At that moment, the door to his office opened abruptly, and Harper appeared on the threshold. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. His eyes narrowed. "I'm working," Eric answered calmly, not looking up. Harper stepped closer, leaning across the table. "Are you digging for me?" Eric paused for a moment, then looked up. "I'm looking for the truth. This isn't digging, Harper. It's my job." "Your job is to support your own, not help these." Harper paused, noticing the evidence folder on the table. "Do you want to take a look?" Eric offered sarcastically. Harper was silent for a few seconds, then turned and left, slamming the door loudly. Eric realized that there wasn't much time now. He had to get this evidence to his superiors as soon as possible, before Harper tried to destroy it. It was a busy morning at the station. Eric Sanders was nervously flipping through the papers on his desk, preparing for an important meeting with his supervisor. On the desk in front of him was evidence that could completely destroy the charges against Jamal. Surveillance footage, screenshots, testimony from Linda and other witnesses all pointed to one thing: Jamal had nothing to do with the robbery. But the euphoria of discovering the truth was short-lived, because Eric knew Harper wouldn't give up so easily. Eric heard loud voices in the corridor of the station. A moment later, the door to his office swung open, and Harper appeared on the doorstep. His face was contorted with anger, his eyes full of threat. "You want me to let this guy go, don't you?" Harper began, fury in his voice. Eric didn't answer, only looked up at him. "He's a criminal. You realize that, don't you?" Harper continued, his words seeming empty and unfair. "He was in that neighborhood at that moment, and we don't need people like him." "But we have proof, Harper. He was at the store. He has an alibi. And you know all these accusations are lies," Eric said, still remaining calm. "It doesn't change the fact that he's black. It doesn't change the fact that people like him are always guilty in the eyes of people like us." Harper shouted, his face reddening with anger. "We can make it look different." Eric knew that this conversation was not going to lead to anything good. He took a deep breath and stood up from the table. "I'll do the right thing. Harper, you'll let him go, and we'll let you know the charges are dropped." His voice was firm but restrained. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Jamal sat in a small waiting cell. He knew that his release was possible, but he still felt the pressure mounting. His thoughts were racing, but he tried not to let fear and anger take over. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to let this moment go. Suddenly the door opened, and Harper came in. He stood in the doorway, as if hesitant to come any closer. His face was twisted in a mask of contempt. "Ew, you can go," Harper said with obvious disgust, not even looking at Jamal. Jamal glanced at him, but didn't bother to answer. All he wanted was to get out of here and get his life back, no matter how hard it was. He knew Harper would probably haunt him for a long time, but he wasn't going to be afraid. "That's not justice," Jamal said, rising from his seat and moving slowly toward the exit. "You knew all this and you tried to break me anyway." Harper only laughed in response, his laugh dry and sinister. "You're not gonna win, kid. You think things are gonna change. You don't realize who you're messing with. This isn't over." Jamal paused in the cell doorway, then turned slowly, looking directly into Harper's eyes. "I'm not going to continue this fight with you, but I will fight for the truth, for the people who are going through this, and I'm not alone. You're gonna stay where you are, and I'm gonna move on." He walked out of the cell, leaving Harper standing there, angry and scornful. Jamal knew he had many more hard days ahead of him, but one thing was certain: he was not alone. On the street, when Jamal left the courthouse, he was greeted by friends and activists. There was relief in their eyes, but also something more: a certainty that the fight was just beginning. With the support of people like Sanders and the power of truth, Jamal knew that his path to justice would be difficult, but still possible. Jamal walked down the street, feeling the tension inside his body slowly ebb away with each step. He had just left the courthouse, and although his charges had been dropped, he realized it was only a small victory. He knew he had a long way to go to make a real change, but in this moment, he was surrounded by people who supported him, and that gave him strength. When Jamal reached his neighborhood, he was met by several locals. They already knew about his release and wanted to congratulate him. The streets were filled with discussions, and soon several dancing people gathered in the main square. Among them were activists, ordinary locals, and those who knew Jamal personally and had witnessed the injustice that had shackled his life. "We are all with you, Jamal. You have shown that we can fight," said an old man who had lived in the neighborhood all his life. "It's not just your victory, it's our victory," added Karen, an activist who helped gather evidence. "We all know Harper is not alone. He's just part of the system." Jamal nodded, but there was still anxiety inside him. He realized that whoever broke the system would face much greater difficulties. But one thing was clear: he was not alone. A gathering at the community center, where dozens of people had already gathered, Jamal spoke about his experiences and how he came into the spotlight. He shared the story of how Harper tried to manipulate evidence, humiliate and intimidate him. "Yesterday I thought I was going to lose, but now I realize that this fight is not just for me. It's a fight for everyone who faces injustice, for all of us," Jamal said. Heated speeches began to be heard among those gathered. One by one, local residents told their experiences. "They are always picking on us," said Marcus, a local entrepreneur. "I used to open a store myself, and every time my customers, people of darker skin color, try to come in, they immediately label them. We have always been in their eyes a threat to their order, but after all, we're just trying to live and work." "There's a problem in the system. It's not just Harper," Karen added. It's everyone. The cops, the judges, those who control our lives. The system doesn't support us, it uses us. The discussion gradually evolved into deeper reflections on systemic discrimination. People began to share examples of how they had been harassed or detained for no reason. Some told how they had been deprived of their rights just because their skin color did not match the skin color of those who were usually in the spotlight. One of the locals, Juan, who was an immigrant, stood up and said, "I came here with the hope of a better life, but I constantly feel suspicion on me, as if I have something to prove, even if I haven't done anything. Every time I find a job, someone from the authorities always tries to find a reason to persecute me." "We all suffer from the same problem," Jamal said. "We all see how the same mechanism from the inside does not work, how our rights are constantly violated, and how the system makes us fight for every step. But we can change that. We will not be silent." That evening was a turning point for the entire community. The community began to come together to fight for their rights. People who had previously lived alone began to speak openly about their pain and concerns, and most importantly, they began to support each other. After the meeting, Jamal stayed to talk some more with a few activists, discussing how they could organize a campaign to educate locals about human rights and justice. Although difficulties were on the horizon, he knew that with this support they could make a real difference. The thought kept popping into his head, if each of them would fight for the truth instead of hiding in the shadows of fear, maybe one day they could change the world. Jamal's story began to rapidly gain resonance. The local news regularly reported on the injustice faced by the young man. However, this was only the beginning. The video of his detention, shot by eyewitnesses, went viral on the internet, spreading at an incredible rate. People began discussing the case not only in cities but also beyond. Activists and human rights defenders joined the fight, sharpening the issues of systemic discrimination and police violence. The video was recorded on a smartphone by a passerby who happened to be nearby at the time of the arrest. It recorded the moment when Jamal, without resisting, stood in the hands of a police officers while Harper shouted at him and demonstrated his authority. The publication of the clip caused a storm of emotions on social media. People were shocked at how groundless and aggressive the officers acted and how his actions seemed clearly unreasonable. The video soon made its way to platforms such as YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, where it received millions of views. Slogans like "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Brutality" became trends, and the voice of the people expressing support for Jamal literally flooded the internet. Hundreds of posts appear online where people shared their stories of injustice and discrimination. This was not just a video about detention, but a signal that it was time to change the system. "Look at the way he's acting with him, just because he's black," wrote activist Sarah Lynn in her post. "It doesn't matter who you are. You don't have to be humiliated to prove your innocence." Sarah, a well-known human rights activist who has spent years fighting police brutality, quickly became one of the leading voices in support of Jamal. Her posts about Jamal's case were actively circulated, and she herself began fundraising for legal support for his case. At this time at the station, Harper knew the situation was spiraling out of control. He couldn't have realized how quickly things had turned against him. His reputation was deteriorating by the day, and tensions among his colleagues were rising. He realized that if the situation wasn't resolved quickly, it could lead to his dismissal or even a criminal case. However, he had one thing on his side: almost everyone in the station was silent, hoping that the storm would subside on its own. Meanwhile, Jamal and his attorneys began preparing a lawsuit against Harper and the police department. They were joined by other victims of Harper's actions, and people's support only grew stronger. Local activists organized rallies, demanding not only punishment for Harper, but also serious reforms in the police force to prevent similar incidents in the future. Mass demonstrations began to take place in the city. The participants not only supported Jamal, but also made demands for reforms in the law enforcement agencies. On the posters, one could see slogans like "Equality for all," "Police cannot be unpunished," and "Justice for everyone." These actions attracted the attention not only of local media, but also of international human rights organizations. Jamal couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. All his worries, all his struggles were now echoing in people's hearts. He received support not only from the community, but also from activists around the world. Every day, more and more posts appeared on social media demanding an investigation into the actions of police officers, Harper, and action against systemic discrimination. However, in doing so, Jamal felt that his personal life would no longer be the same. While his release and court victory were important steps, the real struggle was just beginning. The problems facing people like him were much deeper. In an interview with a local newspaper, Jamal said, "This is not just my victory. This is a victory for all those who have ever felt like their lives don't matter. We all deserve equality, and I will fight for it until I see change." The video that started with a small incident was now a driving force. The mountain of truth and public opinion continued to gain momentum. The more people learned about Jamal's case, the more they realized the importance of collective effort. It became an example of how public opinion can turn the tide and force the system to face the truth. The issue of police violence and racial discrimination has finally moved beyond one story to become an issue for the entire nation. The news that Harper had been suspended shook the entire city. Although it was only a temporary solution, it was still a big step towards change. For many of the town's residents, it was a long-awaited victory. Though final justice was still a long way off, but the very possibility that someone who had behaved with such impunity would finally be held accountable made many believe in the power of change. On the first day after he was suspended, Harper did not hide his anger. His Saturday in his empty office, clutching a piece of paper with an order on it. All this time, he had thought that if he was aggressive enough, tough enough, no one would dare question his actions. He had been confident of his impunity. But now that he was forced to take a leave of absence from the investigation, his world was beginning to crumble. While Harper tried to justify himself and escape public condemnation, on the other side of town, more serious work began. The internal investigation initiated by the police department was a complex and lengthy process. It involved independent observers, human rights activists, and local activists, and the police department itself was under pressure from public opinion for change. Eric Sanders, despite his affection for his case, knew the police system wouldn't change overnight. But the internal investigation was the first step. He was eager to see the official proceedings begin and hoped it would set an example for other departments across the country. Rallies continued on the street and in public places to support police reforms. Protesters demanded not only punishment for Harper, but also an anti-racism training system for all police officers, and the establishment of independent commissions of inquiry into police violence. One by one, police officers began to realize that they could not hide their mistakes and inappropriate actions. With each passing day, it became more and more evident that society would no longer accept simply ignoring systemic problems. Several major cities began to discuss creating new standards for dealing with minorities and groups in need of protection. Meanwhile, Jamal continued his journey in his fight for justice. Although he had already been released and was receiving support from many, he realized that the real challenge was yet to come. He was active in organizations that fought for the rights of Black people and other marginalized groups, and he shared his experiences in interviews and at rallies. Once, During such a gathering, where steps to reform the police system were being discussed, Jamal got up on stage in front of a crowd of people gathered in the square and spoke. "We can't afford to stop there. We cannot just celebrate a small victory. We must continue to fight for those who cannot speak. For those who have suffered before us, we must fight for justice every day, every hour. We will keep fighting until we see change." Applause and shouts of encouragement echoed through the square. People looked at him, at his confidence, at his willpower. He was a symbol of those who do not give up, who keep going despite all the difficulties. The Harper investigation was gaining momentum. A growing number of witnesses, including other officers, began to come forward to say that Harper often exhibited aggressive behavior, especially toward people with darker skin. Evidence was found that he repeatedly used force when it was unwarranted, and even in some cases tried to cover up his actions. A formal case began to be built against him, which could lead to his dismissal and trial. A local newspaper ran an article detailing the whole situation, with quotes from witnesses and human rights activists. The article quickly went viral, and soon everyone was talking about the need for more serious reforms, so that no one would be at risk of violence simply because of the color of their skin. When Harper was called to testify as part of the investigation, he already knew his days in the service were numbered. He sat there in the courtroom with a cold stare, trying to keep his composure, but his face was pale. Harper tried to justify himself, saying that he had acted according to procedures and that, he said, Jamal had not behaved properly. But the evidence was too clear for his excuse to have the slightest chance of success. His suspension was only the first step. The next step was an investigation that would likely lead to more serious consequences for him. Jamal, as he watched this process unfold, realized that this was just the beginning, and no matter what happened next, he and other activists would continue to fight for change in the system. After Harper's case became a daily topic in the news and discussions, and Jamal continued to fight for justice, he realized that he needed to take another step to consolidate his victory, not just in a legal or political sense, but in a deeper cultural context. He decided to create a work of art that would symbolize that justice is still possible, despite all the obstacles faced by people like him. Jamal was a talented artist, and although in the past his art had been more about personal experiences and visual images of everyday life, he now felt that his paintbrush should tell the story of the whole community, the whole struggle and hope. He began working on a painting that would reflect everything that had happened over the past few months, everything he had experienced that was part of the struggle for equality. He decided to call the painting The Picture of Truth. It depicted Jamal himself, with his gaze raised as if he were looking into the future, but with a strength that came not only from him but from his people. Around him was a crowd, not aggressive but determined. They were the faces of those who supported him, who fought him. At the bottom of the painting were scenes of police violence, but they looked distant, like something old that was bound to be defeated. On the horizon, however, you could see sunlight, symbolizing hope and change. When the work was completed, Jamal decided that the painting should become part of the city, a reminder that the struggle for justice should not be forgotten. He approached the city council with a proposal to display his painting in the city hall, in the heart of the city. The local authorities, inspired by what had happened over the past months and the support Jamal had received, happily agreed. And so, at the official opening ceremony, the painting was hung on the wall of the main hall of the town hall. A crowd of locals gathered there to see art and truth merge into one symbolic form. Jamal stood next to the painting, proud but calm. He realized that this painting was not just an image, but a whole story, a whole world reflecting what had been and what would be. When the mayor, Mr. Taylor, said in his speech that the painting would become a symbol of struggle and change, and that it would remain there until that injustice itself disappeared, the room erupted in applause. It was an acknowledgement that all the worries and efforts of Jamal, his community, human rights defenders, and activists had not been in vain. Each day Jamal noticed more and more people coming to the town hall to see the painting. There were children, elderly people, families, and whole groups of art and history students standing there. They stopped their gazes at the painting, discussed what it symbolized, and talked about the importance of fighting for justice. Jamal also gave tours to local school children, explaining to them that the painting is not just an image, but a reminder that everyone has the right to justice and that no one should suffer because of their race or background. He spoke of the importance of this work to all those who have ever faced discrimination, and how important it is to keep fighting without giving up. At one point, his work became not just a painting in the town hall, but part of the city's culture. Locals began wearing T-shirts with the painting, and activists used it in their protests to remind them of the need for reforms in the police system. Jamal realized that by creating this painting, he was not only expressing his pain, but also conveying strength and hope to an entire generation. The difficulties hadn't disappeared, and there was more work to be done, but Jamal knew that his story was only part of a larger struggle in which every voice mattered. His painting was a symbol of truth, a truth that cannot be suppressed, a truth that will lead to change. He stood in front of the painting, looked at the faces of the people, at their expressions, and realized that this struggle was not over yet, but it had already become part of history, part of culture, part of the city, and this was perhaps the most important step towards real justice. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.